They say war makes men out of boys overnight, but for the Australian Airmen of World War II, it made them the old young. They flew 5 miles high to save a world they would never see the same way again. While an engine can be rebuilt and a fuselage repainted, a human soul forged in the fire of total war can never be returned to its original state. Why did an entire generation accept a fate that vanished into the clouds? Join us as we reawaken the roar of the Merlin engines and uncover the hidden hearts of the warriors who left their youth in the sky. In the early 1940s, across the vast sun-drenched landscapes of Australia, a fever of patriotism and adventure gripped the hearts of its youth. For a generation raised in the quiet, rural isolation of the post-depression era, the Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF, offered something more than just a call to duty. It offered the sky. To a 20-year-old farmhand from the Riverina or a bank clerk in Melbourne, the image of the dashing pilot, leather jacket, silk scarf, and wings pinned to the chest was the ultimate symbol of modern heroism. Thousands flocked to recruitment centers, their heads filled with the romanticized imagery of the Knights of the Air, fueled by propaganda films and the swashbuckling tales of World War I aces. The enthusiasm was infectious, born of a profound innocence that only those who have never seen a burning cockpit can possess. These young men didn't dream of the industrial-scale slaughter of the Blitz. They dreamed of the freedom of the clouds. They stood in long queues, hoping to pass the rigorous medical exams, praying their eyesight was sharp enough and their hearts steady enough to be selected for pilot training. In their minds, the war was a grand, noble adventure, a chance to see the world, to escape the mundane life of the bush, and to prove their mateship on a global stage. However, the reality of the RAAF was a cold, efficient machine that quickly began to sort these dreams into practical categories. For every man who made it into the pilot's seat, dozens of others found themselves redirected to the roles that were less glamorous but equally vital. The Air Force needed navigators, wireless operators, bomb aimers, flight engineers, and air gunners. It needed ground crews, the grease monkeys, who would spend their nights in freezing hangars. For many, the first sting of wartime reality was the realization that they would not be the ones holding the joystick, but instead they would be squeezed into a cramped rear turret or hunched over a flickering radio set in the dark. The training itself was a grueling process of unlearning civilian life. At training schools under the Empire Air Training Scheme, EATS, the naive boys were subjected to a relentless regime of mathematics, physics, and discipline. They flew in aging tiger moths or whirraways, learning the unforgiving laws of aerodynamics. It was here that the first shadows began to fall over their excitement. They saw classmates wash out, or worse, witness the sudden, violent training accidents that claim lives before the men ever saw an enemy. By the time these young Australians received their wings or their brevet badges and boarded the troop ships for overseas service, a subtle change had occurred. The wide-eyed boy who had left the farm was gone, replaced by a technician of war. They were still eager, still bonded by the legendary Australian sense of humor, but the adventure had begun to take on a sharper, more serious edge. They were heading toward a horizon they could not yet see, carrying the weight of a nation's expectations, and clutching a dream of flight that was about to be ground down by the relentless machinery of total war. For the young Australians arriving at the RAAF squadrons in the United Kingdom, the romanticized dream of flight died a swift death in the cold gray mist of the Atlantic. The war in the air was not a series of gallant dogfights. It was a grueling war of attrition fought over the desolate wastes of the Bay of Biscay and the North Atlantic. For crews assigned to Coastal Command, the mission was a test of psychological endurance. They flew Sunderlands or Catalinas on anti-submarine patrols that lasted upwards of 12 hours. Long, monotonous stretches of staring at the endless white caps of the ocean, punctuated by moments of sheer, heart-stopping terror. The tension was a physical presence in the cockpit. The men knew the statistics, and the statistics were grim. In the peak years of the air war, the life expectancy of a new crew was terrifyingly short. It was often said that if a crew survived their first 4 missions, they had beaten the odds. Yet for many, even that small milestone was out of reach. A half disappeared was not just a figure of speech, it was the reality of the morning roll call. You would go to breakfast with a full table of mates, and by dinner, 3 chairs would be empty, their occupants' personal belongings already being packed away into trunks by the dead man's search teams. The environment itself was a silent killer. The RAAF crews faced a trifecta of lethality. The advanced Junkers U-88 fighters of the Luftwaffe, the deadly anti-aircraft fire from U-boats, and the unforgiving Atlantic weather. Flying at low altitudes to spot periscopes meant there was zero margin for error. If an engine failed or a wing clipped a rogue wave in a storm, there was no parachuting to safety. The freezing water would claim a man in minutes. This constant proximity to a nameless, watery grave bred a specific kind of fatalism. The men stopped making long-term plans. They lived mission to mission, cigarette to cigarette. Behind the bravado and the bawdy songs in the mess hall lay the shadow of the lack of moral fiber, a cruel military designation for those whose nerves finally snapped. The fear was not just of dying, but of failing one's mates. Every Australian airman carried the weight of knowing that the lives of the other 6 or 7 men in the plane depended entirely on his ability to suppress his own terror. This was the mateship of the stratosphere, a bond forged not in sunshine, but in the shivering darkness of a flak-filled sky. By the time an airman reached the midpoint of his tour, the naive boy from the Riverina was long gone. His eyes had taken on a hollow, distant look, the 1,000-yard stare of the air. He had watched his friends spiral into the sea in balls of flame, unable to help, forced to keep flying his own course. The sky, once a place of freedom, had become a graveyard. These missions of no return mowed down the brightest of a generation, leaving the survivors to grapple with a haunting question. Why had they been spared when so many better men were gone? For the Australian Airmen stationed in the United Kingdom, the war was not confined to the cockpit. When they were not 5 miles high in the freezing dark, they were living in the heart of a nation under siege. During their leave in London, the young RAAF crews experienced a surreal juxtaposition. The city was a place of frantic, desperate joy and terrifying destruction. They walked the streets of a capital that was being systematically dismantled by the Luftwaffe, witnessing a side of the conflict that most soldiers never see, the war against the innocent. Living in London during the Blitz, the Australians saw the same faces every night in the underground stations. Mothers clutching children, elderly men reading newspapers by flashlight as the earth above them shook with the thud of high explosives. This shared proximity to danger created a unique bond between the diggers and the British civilians. The Australians, known for their easygoing nature and generous pay packets, often shared their rations and their humor with those huddling in the shelters. But beneath the smiles lay a heavy, complicated realization. They were watching the city burn from the ground, knowing that in a few days they would be the ones dropping the same fires onto the cities of Germany. This was the moral gray zone of Bomber Command. Every night, the RAF crews took off in their Lancasters or Halifaxes to strike back at the heart of the Third Reich. They flew into a wall of flak and night fighters, fueled by the sight of the smoking ruins of London or Coventry. They felt the visceral satisfaction of hitting back, but they also understood the human cost. From 30,000 feet, a city looks like a map, and a bomb is just a coordinate. But after a week in London, they knew that every target was someone's home. Every industrial zone was a neighborhood of people exactly like the ones they had befriended in the London shelters. The psychological toll of this song of fire and shadow was immense. The airmen lived in a state of constant emotional whiplash. One night, they were the victims of the Blitz, ducking into doorways as the sirens wailed. The next, they were the architects of the firestorms over Hamburg or Dresden. They saw the charred remains of London's East End and recognized the same blackened skeletons of buildings they were creating across the Channel. It was a cycle of destruction that felt endless, and it began to erode the simple right versus wrong narrative they had brought from Australia. In the pubs of Soho, the RAAF boys drank to forget the sights they had seen, both on the ground and from the air. They celebrated their survival with a frantic intensity, knowing that the London fog they walked through was often a mixture of mist and the smoke of a city still smoldering from the night before. This shared agony with the British people forged a deep, lasting empathy, but it also matured the Australians in a brutal way. They were no longer just pilots, they were witnesses to the totalization of modern war, where the line between the front line and the backyard had vanished into a cloud of soot and ash. While thousands of Australian airmen were braving the freezing altitudes over Europe, another contingent of the RAAF was being forged in a vastly different but equally unforgiving crucible: the scorched deserts of North Africa and the Middle East. From the airfields of Egypt and Palestine to the rugged mountains of Syria, the Australian squadrons found themselves engaged in a war of dust. Here, the primary enemy was often not the Italian Regia Aeronautica or the German Luftwaffe, but the environment itself, a relentless, abrasive landscape that seemed determined to grind both man and machine into the earth. The physical conditions were a far cry from the lush, green air bases of England. In the western desert, life was stripped down to its most brutal essentials. Water was a precious, rationed commodity, often tasting of the petrol tins in which it was transported. The heat was a living entity, a shimmering wall of fire that made the metal skin of a kitty hawk or a Spitfire too hot to touch by noon. In the middle of this, the RAAF ground crews performed miracles of improvisation. They worked in open pits, shielded only by makeshift canvas, fighting a losing battle against the Khamsin, the fierce sandstorms that could strip the paint off a wing and clog a finely tuned engine in seconds. The psychological attrition was just as severe as the mechanical wear. The Australian airmen lived in dugouts or flimsy tents, their uniforms often reduced to a pair of shorts, boots, and a slouch hat as they tried to cope with the sweltering climate. Disease, dysentery, desert sores, and malaria was a constant shadow claiming more men than the enemy's anti-aircraft fire. The RAAF crews felt forgotten, operating at the end of a long, precarious supply line, flying aircraft that were often second-hand or patched together with cannibalized parts from wrecked planes. Yet it was in this deprivation that the legendary Australian resilience shone brightest. Despite the lack of proper equipment, they held the key defensive lines at El Alamein and provided the vital air cover that allowed the desert rats to finally turn the tide. The air war over the desert was a series of frantic, low-level scuffles. Unlike the high-altitude formations of Europe, North African combat was a dogfighter's war, visceral, close quarters, and deadly. RAAF pilots engaged in high-speed chases just feet above the dunes, where a single mistake or a sudden downdraft meant an instant, fiery death in the sand. When they returned to their bases, there were no pubs or London theaters for relief. There was only the vast, silent desert, the biting cold of the Sahara night, and the endless task of cleaning grit out of their food, their eyes, and their weapons. By the time the North African campaign concluded, the men of the RAAF were desert-hardened. They were leaner, darker, and deeply cynical, their spirits tempered by the harsh glare of the sun and the unyielding grit of the sand. They had proven that the Australian airmen could adapt to any terrain, but the cost was visible in their weathered faces and their old young eyes. They had survived a war of steel and sand, but the true test was yet to come, as the shadows of a new threat began to stretch toward their own sun-drenched shores from the north. By early 1942, the strategic reality for the men of the RAAF underwent a violent and terrifying inversion. For years, they had fought as the away team, serving the interests of the British Empire on distant shores. But with the lightning-fast fall of Singapore in February, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, the war was no longer an overseas adventure. It was an existential threat to their own families. As the Japanese rising sun swept southward through Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, a chilling realization gripped the Australian airmen. The front line was now moving toward their own backyards. This period was marked by a frantic, almost desperate atmosphere of making do. While the most modern Spitfires and Lancasters remained tied to the European theater, the RAAF pilots in the Pacific were often forced into battle flying obsolete or suicidal aircraft. They took to the skies in Wirraways, modified trainers that were little more than canvas and wood, to face the Mitsubishi Zero, the most lethal dogfighter of its era. It was a David and Goliath struggle fought in the air. To fly a Wirraway against a Zero was not just brave, it was a calculated sacrifice. These young men were the thin blue line holding the gate, buying time with their lives while the nation scrambled to bring its veteran squadrons back from the Middle East. The psychological nature of the war also shifted. In Europe, the fear was of flak or fire. In the Pacific, the fear was something much darker and more visceral. The stories coming out of Singapore and the islands told of a relentless enemy who did not follow the Geneva Convention as understood in the West. For a RAAF pilot, the nightmare was no longer just the crash, it was the prospect of being taken alive. The dread of being captured or executed, the beheading of downed airmen, loomed over every sortie. This was a war without mercy, fought over jagged jungles and shark-infested waters where a parachute offered no guarantee of survival. The stress of this period was compounded by a sense of isolation. Many airmen felt a stinging resentment toward the Singapore strategy that had left their homelands so exposed. They were fighting with seconds and hand-me-downs while the heart of the RAAF's strength was still thousands of miles away. The tension in the mess halls changed. The light-hearted banter was replaced by a grim, protective fury. They weren't just fighting for democracy or the king anymore. They were fighting to prevent the bombs they had seen fall on London from falling on Sydney, Melbourne, or Darwin. This inversion turned the RAAF into a truly national force. The pilots became the sentinels of the coast, flying exhausted patrols over the vast empty reaches of the Australian North. They were tired, their equipment was failing, and the enemy seemed unstoppable. Yet in this crucible of fear and desperation, the RAAF found a new, grittier identity. They learned to fight with their backs against the wall, preparing for the grueling counteroffensive that would eventually lead them into the green hell of New Guinea. If the North African desert was a war of heat and dust, New Guinea was a descent into a prehistoric, humid nightmare. For the RAAF crews deployed to Papua and New Guinea, the green hell was a theater of war that challenged the very limits of human and mechanical endurance. Here the enemy was not just the Japanese Zero, but a landscape so violent and unforgiving that it seemed to loathe the presence of man. The airmen found themselves operating in a world of jagged, cloud-shrouded peaks, impenetrable jungle canopies, and a climate that rotted everything it touched, from the canvas of the wings to the very skin on their bones. The logistical reality was a constant struggle against the elements. Bases like Milne Bay or Port Moresby were often little more than strips of Marston matting laid over oozing black mud. Life for the ground crews was an unrelenting cycle of labor in a steam bath atmosphere. Technical crews, the unsung heroes of the Pacific, often slept directly under the wings of their P-40 Kitty Hawks or Beaufort bombers, waking up every few hours to drain water from fuel lines or patch up airframes damaged by tropical corrosion. They worked by flashlight in the middle of torrential downpours, plagued by swarms of malarial mosquitoes and the constant threat of scrub typhus. There was no behind the lines in New Guinea. The jungle was everywhere, and it was always closing in. For the pilots, flying over New Guinea was a terrifying gamble. The Owen Stanley Range, with its razorback ridges and unpredictable willy-waws, sudden mountain winds, claimed more aircraft than enemy fire. If a plane went down, the pilot faced a choice between a quick death in a crash or a slow, agonizing struggle through a jungle so dense that search planes couldn't see a signal fire through the canopy. The RAAF crews specialized in scrapping, low-level strafing runs through narrow valleys, flying so close to the trees that they often returned with leaves and branches stuck in their radiators. They were providing the vital flying artillery for the Australian diggers on the Kokoda track, and the bond between the man in the mud and the man in the cockpit became a sacred alliance of survival. The psychological attrition in New Guinea was profound. The men were perpetually exhausted, their bodies racked by tropical fevers and jungle rot. The vibrant, cocky young men who had left Australia were now hollow-eyed and gaunt. Their skin turned a sickly yellow from the atabrine tablets they took to ward off malaria. The adventure had long ago dissolved into a repetitive cycle of rain, mud, and blood. There were no victory parades in the jungle, only the grim satisfaction of a mission completed and the hollow silence of a tent where a mate's cot remained empty. By the time the tide finally turned in the Pacific, the RAAF in New Guinea had become a force of expert survivors. They had learned to conquer a terrain that everyone said was unconquerable. But as they looked toward the final push, the cost was etched into every face. They had survived the green hell, but the jungle had taken something from them. a piece of their youth that no amount of victory would ever be able to replace. As the war in the Pacific drew to its inevitable conclusion, a strange and hollow atmosphere settled over the RAAF squadrons. Even as the Japanese Empire crumbled, the Australian Airmen were tasked with mopping up operations across the scattered islands of the archipelago. These missions, strafing isolated enemy outposts or patrolling abandoned shorelines, often felt dangerously meaningless. The men were no longer the vibrant enthusiasts of 1940. They were the old young, veterans of 23 who had seen too much fire and too much mud. The adrenaline of the early years had been replaced by a heavy, numbing stasis. They flew with a robotic precision, their emotions cauterized by the loss of so many friends that they no longer dared to learn the names of the new replacements. When the surrender was finally signed, there was no sudden explosion of joy for many of the airmen. Instead, there was an overwhelming, crushing sense of exhaustion. The return to civilian life in Australia was a jarring, silent transition. They traded their flight suits for cheap wool suits and returned to the banks, the farms, and the shops they had left 5 years prior. But while they walked the familiar streets of Sydney or Melbourne, their minds remained suspended at 20,000 feet or lost in the tangled shadows of the Owen Stanleys. They were the souls that never landed, men who had spent their formative years in a world of high-velocity death and were now expected to care about the mundane trifexes of peacetime life. The psychological scars, though invisible, were as permanent as the aluminum monuments in the museums. Many survivors became brutally stoic or emotionally cold, unable to bridge the gap between their wartime experiences and the domestic expectations of their families. They suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD, haunted by the thousand-yard stare and the nocturnal roar of Merlin engines in their dreams. Some found they could no longer be friendly in the way they used to be. The war had stripped away their patience for trivialities and left behind a jagged, restless core. They had survived the fire, but they were forever singed by it, carrying a quiet, heavy grief for the mateship that only exists when death is a constant companion. Today we return to the museum where we began. We look at the Lancaster, the Spitfire, and the Kitty Hawk, and we see the beauty of their lines and the power of their history. But we must remember that the most significant relics of the war were the men themselves. Human beings who were irreparably altered by the weight of their duty. A machine can be restored, its paint refreshed, and its engines polished for display. But a human soul, once forged in the crucible of total war, can never be returned to its original state. Aircraft can be put in museums, as the old saying goes, but the trauma of the human heart cannot be put on display. The legacy of the RAAF in World War II is a story of incredible victory, yes, but it is also a story of immense, quiet sacrifice. It is the story of a generation that took to the sky to save their world, and in doing so, left a piece of their humanity in the clouds forever. As the museum lights dim and the doors lock for the night, the silence remains, a tribute to the boys who dreamed of flight and the men who never truly came home.